Watch this. No way!
Michael Morrison, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for agreeing to meet us.
Delighted to be here, seeing you both in St Andrews.
Yeah, it's always good to meet fellow golf nuts and nerds and around St Andrews, and it's being up here for the Open is quite special. But you've got something going on at St Andrews this week. What are you doing up here?
Well, having recently published my new book, in fact this was only a week ago Friday, I was invited to an event that the RNA has organised called Meet the Author. And so in about a couple of hours' time at the Golf Museum, there's 6 of us who are going to talk this evening on our books that we've recently published. And then there's been such an outpouring of terrific books on golf history over the last few years that there's a second session on Tuesday evening with another group of authors. Yeah. So I think it's a great thing that the RNA and more generally golf is paying more attention to the history of the game.
Yeah.
Because I think for quite a long time the history was sort of pushed a little bit into the background, but I think people are now beginning to realise that our game is a wonderful game to play, but also the legacy that we have from the past, and we can connect to it to this very day and play on the same land where our forefathers played golf. I just think it makes it quite special. So I'm really happy to be involved in this.
Well, it's just an amazing. But I'm going to ask you to put your microphone just a little bit closer. That's absolutely perfect. But it's great that we get people like yourselves who are so interested in the history that are willing to dig deep. But this, of course, isn't your first. I should say I'm also joined by Bruce. So Bruce is here. He's just sat there in silence. But this isn't your first book, is it? Partner.
No, this is my 4th book. So I started writing by accident, literally. I had to have both my hips replaced because they'd worn out. And so I was off golf for the winter. This was back in 10 years ago, 2012. And so my local golf club is the Gog Golf Club in Cambridge. And so I just asked to help out, to tidy up the archives. It's something to do, to be around my mates playing golf. And I couldn't join them. And I started digging around and trying to figure out what was what, and I found some old historical material, one of which was a letter written by James Braid in 1929 describing how he would change the old course at the Gogs at that time. And I thought this was wonderful. I'd never seen anything like this before. We'd had a centenary book in 2001, but it hadn't referred to the details.
Hadn't surfaced, yeah.
So that got me started, and I thought I'd just give a fireside presentation to some friends about how the course developed, and they put up a sign in the club, say anybody's interested to come and hear Mike's talk, and 100 people signed up. So I then had to put together a formal presentation. That sort of got me more and more interested. How
was that? Was that pressure?
No, career-wise, I used to do a lot of presentations.
No.
Yeah, no, it was just, it had been a while since I'd done a presentation. So yeah, I was used to doing it, but not in a golf context.
Yeah.
And so that was the first foray into golf course history and golf course architecture, really, and exactly that piqued your interest.
It did, and so the second book came along quite quickly because being in Cambridge University Golf Club had been there well before the Gogs had been there. Gogs was 1901. Most evidence seemed to say that Cambridge University Golf Club was formed in 1875. That's what they said on their website. And I knew the president of this CGC Golf Club, and I said, have you got any minute books or anything historical? He says, oh yeah, we have these 2 big leather-bound books stored in one of the colleges. I said, can I have a look at them? And he said, yes, certainly. So I finally got there, and the first page that I opened was 1889. The secretary was Harry Colt.
Wow.
And the next year he would become captain of the University Golf Club. So the first handwriting in the first book in the minutes is written by Harry Colt.
Look at that.
And so that was 1889, but they had no minutes before then.
Yeah.
So I then started
had to correct them on their date.
So this was the University Golf Club.
Yes.
Obviously there's the team, Cambridge University.
Yes.
And they were playing at at a club that bore the same name. Where was that?
Well, the University Golf Club, it turns out, was actually formed in 1869 by one person from Royal North Devon, George Gossett, and a young Scotsman, Andrew Graham Murray from Edinburgh.
Right.
And so that made it transpired. It made Cambridge University Golf Club one of the oldest half-dozen golf clubs in England.
Oh, right.
And so I then started digging and finding old research material and newspapers and clippings about golf being played on a common in Cambridge called Coldham Common.
Right.
Which, and the reason for the title of my book was The Worst Golf Course Ever. And that was Bernard Darwin, who was also a member of Cambridge University Golf Club in the mid-1890s. And when his writing career got going, he described Coldham Common as the worst golf course I've ever seen, and many others would award it a like distinction. So hence I chose that as the title of the book, which was the history of Cambridge University Golf Club up to 1990. It didn't go up to modern times, just the old history. So that was my next book.
And doesn't he talks about, I think, well, you mentioned it in the book, how that it was on pretty soggy, marshy kind of terrain that didn't drain all that well, and I think play was only permitted really in the wintertime. Was there a live rifle range or something that crossed part of the course? So
this is why it was described as the worst golf course ever. Yes.
Not easy
they could only play in the winter months because the cattle came back on. The commoners had rights in the summer. It was flat. It was muddy. Originally 9 holes, but they did manage to put together 18 subsequently. But then a railway was built the whole way through the middle of it, and there was a rifle range there as well, which they interacted with from time to time. So it was a bizarre setup. It didn't last, and it all came to an end in 1901, and the students moved to Worlington, where they're still based to this day.
But you're here, I suppose, in St Andrews, ready to do your book signing of your latest book, which is The Great English Golf Boom, 1864 to 1914, A History by Michael Morrison. And you say in the preface to it that it's not often you write a book about the people that come second, but you decided to give it a bash. What was it that inspired you to write this?
Well, it came out of writing the other books, where in each of the books I tried to put the situation of the particular club into some sort of context of what was happening in golf at that time. And each time I was sort of seeing that there was a lot of golf clubs formed at that time, but I couldn't find any source that somebody had written up and said, this is how many golf clubs were formed at that time. There was one, Peter Lewis, who was the director of the Golf Museum at the time, had put one article together where he'd figured out how many clubs were formed up till about 1914, but not in any detail. Yeah. So I thought, once I'd sort of finished writing my third book, I thought, well, that would be an interesting project to figure out how could I figure out how many golf clubs were formed and where they were all were, and what was the nature of them. So, and I figured out how I could do that. I just knew it was going to take a long time to do.
Well, it's interesting. We just had very recently Stephen Proctor on, who talked around a very similar dates, but his book is about kind of the people and how it all changed. But this book's very much about how the clubs formed and how the clubs came about, isn't it? And it tends to be a lot of, I find that a lot of clubs put a lot of stock on being, one of the first or the top 5 in anywhere really. And England is one of those ones that's got Blackheath, which I think I saw a list recently that had the list in order of the English clubs, and Blackheath is like, you will correct me, but it's
1766.
Like years before
1766 is the sort of now acknowledged date.
When
the earliest evidence we have of a
that's
club.
The first, is it, Blackheath?
Well, it was the first club in England playing on Blackheath, just to the east of London, and then there was a second one in 1818 at Manchester on Kersal Moor. 1818, small club. But both of these clubs were essentially expatriate Scots playing golf in England. They were not English golf clubs, if you know what I mean. Yeah. So the first genuine English golf club was formed in North Devon. at Westwood Ho, which subsequently became Royal North Devon.
Yeah.
And that was begun by Englishmen. It was set out as 18 holes, the first 18-hole course in England, by old Tom Morris, who was invited to come down. And it's the oldest existing one still playing on the same land to this day.
I've got a little video I've got a video from a historian named Barry Coyne at West Lancs, so I'd like to play you, and we're going to play it on the podcast too, so they can hear it. But it's quite an interesting little video, so I'd like to get your opinion on it, if I may.
Okay.
I'll play it for you now.
When the West Lancashire Golf Club was founded in 1873 by 7 members of the Royal Liverpool Golf Club, it's important to understand that golf in England was virtually unknown, and in the Field magazine of 1872 there was a little piece written by somebody who signed himself a ridiculer, who said that a few years ago golf was almost unknown except for a few who were supposed to be demented Scotchmen playing old man's hockey. They're looked upon by Englishmen as spoonies who haven't the energy for cricket, football or rackets. And there was a view that even to be seen in England carrying a bag of clubs would indeed lead to ridicule.
So I think hearing that, you kind of, I don't know, first of all, would you agree with the sentiment of it?
Absolutely chimes with what was happening at that time.
Yeah,
yes.
And so how did it come to be then that you have this game which is Scottish that's played by expatriates in the south of England, and then you finally get old Tom come down to Royal North Devon at the time, Westwood Ho, and how did it take root in England if it was so ridiculed?
Well, a critical step was there was a boom in golf in Scotland that happened earlier than the development of golf in England. And the critical year for that was 1848. 2 things happened. The gutta percha ball was invented and replaced the feathery. And the feathery, which was expensive to produce and also didn't last very long, meant that it limited who could play golf. The gutta percha ball was much cheaper and it could be if it broke, you could remold it and use it again. The railways in Scotland began around about that time also. The Glasgow to Edinburgh line was opened in the mid-1840s, and that created the basis for a network. And so by the 1850s, you had a network connecting all the seaside towns to the main towns in Scotland, and a boom subsequently followed. That didn't happen in England. The railways were somewhat more advanced there, and golf took a much longer time to take off. And the reason for that was there just wasn't the knowledge of the game until English people started travelling to Scotland for holidays. Yeah. And I think you might see on the front cover of my book, there's this cartoon which dates back to 1885. It appeared in Punch. And it was called The Golf Stream. And this was signifying all these English golfers going up to Scotland to play golf in the summer. So there was this, there was a need to raise awareness. So there was a directional flow of Englishmen going to Scotland, seeing golf for the first time and thinking, oh, that might be quite interesting. At the same time, there was increasing emigration of Scots south into England. And of course, with the boom in golf having happened in Scotland, more of those Scots coming south knew how to play the game. So most of the early clubs, amongst their founders, were Scots. Yeah. So that was the first sort of step along the way to getting a small number of clubs in England off the ground. But the critical next step was what I think of as the early adopters, were these Englishmen who found this game rather interesting, and although they'd never played it before, they were willing to give it a try. But it's just like any other innovation, it takes time. Yeah. And so the number of clubs in England formed very slowly. So from 1864, when North Devon was formed, to 1879, so that's 15 years, there was only 15 golf clubs formed in England on average once a year. Yeah. But then in the 1880s, the sort of snowball by that time was starting to get larger. Yeah. And by 1889, there were 100 golf clubs in England. Really? So the 1880s was the takeoff period.
Yeah.
So that was essentially from 1864 to 1889, a quarter of a century, 100 clubs were formed.
Yeah.
But then is when the great boom began.
Really began.
Yeah.
I mean, when we think of those early clubs that were formed there, Mike, I mean, I guess going back to Scotland and the origins of the game, when we think of the places where golf grew up being played, it was Dornoch and North Berwick, St Andrews, typically seaside towns. Obviously, the links turf, the links land was the perfect golfing terrain that was fast draining. And did the early adopters of golf in England, did they follow sort of a similar pattern in geographically? Obviously, North Devon, fairly kind of coastal links land.
Yes.
And I guess northwest England too. But of those clubs, as things started to develop pace in the 1870s and 80s, was it primarily based around the coast, just like it was north of the border?
The simple answer is no. And although the blueprint for how golf could develop in England was set out at Royal North Devon, links course, Old Tom, 18 holes, that was not how golf developed in England. It was more of an inland game.
Is that right?
And it was played more on parkland than on links land.
Really?
And more often it was 9 holes that they began with, because it was a new game. And when you set up a club, you've got finances to put it together.
Yeah.
And so they were cautious initially. They weren't, almost every English golfer was a beginner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anybody setting up a club didn't necessarily want to go straight for 18 holes and all the costs associated with that. So typically golf began as a 9-hole game, more inland than at the coast, and mostly on parkland rather than on links land or some of the other land uses such as downland and heathland and to some extent moorland. They gradually started to appear in the picture.
Yeah.
But it was the great boom from 1890 to 1914 when that really began to develop substantially. So a few statistics. 86% of the clubs formed before 1914 were inland.
Really?
85% of them were on parkland, and 78% of them began with 9 holes. So the great boom in England was very different from the formula, the well acknowledged route to how golf was played in Scotland. It was a completely different character.
And we've spoke leading up to this podcast where we've just had a little natter about the book and what's in it. But what also struck me was the parity of gender, or the greater parity of gender than I suppose we have now. So it was a lot of female players back in the early days.
Yes, and this is one of these perceptions I think we have from modern times, is that golf was a male-dominated sport back in those times, that male-only clubs were in the majority, perhaps mirroring the gentlemen's clubs of the time. And certainly at the beginning that was more or less the case, because women initially were only encouraged to try putting and very short forms of golf. Their golf courses were no more than a putter and a chipper.
Well, we're
to
not
go
far
around.
from the Himalayas.
For example, the Himalayas. And Royal North Devon also had a ladies' club on a similar very small course. So, and they wore, the long dresses and bonnets, and there was, it was not considered ladylike to raise a golf club above shoulder height. So, you could see why golf didn't particularly take off. But a critical moment was 1893. The Ladies' Golf Union was formed in 1893, and their first championship took place in 1893. And that established the foundation for women being encouraged to play golf. And by 1895, there was 100 clubs in England where there were ladies playing golf.
Yeah.
But the most dramatic development took place as we approached the First World War. And again, if you look into the book, I've tried to calculate how many golfers there were in England. Yeah. And I came to the figure of about, by 1914, of about 300,000. Yeah. Which, from a standing start of 100 golfers in 1860, and by 10,000 golfers in 1890, we got to 300,000 golfers by 1914. And this was the probably the most critical and interesting fact of all. 1/4 of those golfers were women.
Really? I mean, that's amazing, isn't it?
So most golf clubs in England, by approaching the First World War, were mixed golf clubs. The ones that were men only tended to be a small number of the elite clubs, whose women, typically the mothers and the daughters, played at other clubs nearby, but not at those small number of relatively elitist type clubs.
Yeah.
The vast majority of clubs in England were formed in small towns. More than half of the clubs formed during the Great Boom were formed in towns with less than 10,000 people.
Wow.
So these were small provincial market towns.
Yeah.
And so it tended to be more of a mixed community of golfers, not just the upper classes and the upper middle classes playing, but right down into the lower middle classes, and increasingly towards the end, the skilled working classes were beginning to play golf also. So it was I think this is one of the insights coming out of my research, was it was a more egalitarian game than has been previously supposed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something I guess we see now. It's maybe not quite the case, or it's certainly something that we've talked about when you come to Scotland. It seems like more of an egalitarian game, and it's kind of stayed true to its roots, maybe in that sense. Whereas in England, I guess, correct if I'm wrong, but maybe the two world wars, that moment, that cut-off moment for your book there, things change quite dramatically as a result of the wider economic context going on at that period of time. And I guess there's not only golf courses that were 9 holes based in sort of pastureland or parkland areas, that maybe starts to change a little bit.
There's maybe another book to be written. I think that's what you're saying there, Bruce.
Well,
but
not wanting to line you up for another
not by
sequel.
Yeah,
the sequel.
Not by me just yet.
You need a bit of time, certainly, to recover.
Yeah, but yes, the story does change after the First World War, and to be honest with you, I don't know what that story fully looks like. The one theme that does come out of the motor car was starting to come in at the just before the First World War, and that was beginning to have an impact on further development, because that increased the catchment area. If you only, most golfers, again, another theme that comes out in my book is that when I talk to golfers about what I've been researching and writing about, the most common phrase they first come up with is, "Oh yes, the railways." And when you look at it in detail, the railways had a role to play and facilitated golf, but they'd already been there for 4 decades before golf boomed. So there isn't a close connection between the railways being established and golf being established.
Because I certainly in Scotland always assumed that the railway system is really important. And you look at any decent early Scottish golf club, and there is a railway within half a mile of the club. And certainly I was chatting to someone at West Lancashire recently, and at the starter there said that someone had said to them, "Oh, it's really good of them to build a railway for the golf course, isn't it?" Over at the train station, and it's the other way around. But it's interesting how that didn't develop in England, or certainly doesn't follow that pattern so much.
and the reason as I've interpreted it, is because what happened was most golf clubs were formed inland. So occasional trips to the coast, you took the train.
Yeah.
But the courses were located typically on commons or in pasture around the edges of these towns, because that's where you could get some relatively cheap land to lay out 9 holes. And the people who played golf tended to actually live closer to their golf clubs than they did to the railway station, which they might have taken to go to work. So my broad conclusion, and there's evidence to back it up, is the bicycle might have been more important in terms of a mode of transport, because the bicycle boomed in the mid-1890s, exactly the same time as the golf boom was taking off. And coming back to the theme of women, the bicycle was to some degree helped with the emancipation of women, because they were allowed to then go out in groups socially without having a chaperone looking after them. So there was a theme of emancipation beginning to happen in England at this time. And maybe golf and bicycles were part of that story.
Oh, that's amazing! I love that. I'd love to whack the clubs on the back and get. I could stay upright on a bike.
There's pictures in my book here of bicycle racks at golf clubs, and when I went through all the centenary histories of clubs, you kept seeing references to, in 1907 we built another bicycle rack.
Really?
So this was before the car.
I must say, in the book there is some fantastic imagery. You must have spent ages just trying to find them. Some of the images in there are brilliant.
I was very, very lucky that I got some help from people in the golf historian community.
Yeah, well, we all need a bit of help every now and again, don't we?
There was one guy particularly who collects golf postcards, and that's his niche.
Yeah.
And he kindly lent me a bunch of postcards, which I could then take copies of and use that to sort of bring out the colour meaning black and white. Sort of tell a bit more of the story by showing what these different golf clubs look like. Not so much the golf courses, which don't look very inspiring on a postcard, but their clubhouses and their style of dress.
And it's just seeing things like the bike racks being added. You know, it's obviously forced you. I wouldn't be as aware, but it's obviously forced you to ask the question. You know, why are they putting bike racks in? And it does lead to quite a natural conclusion.
It ties together.
Put more bike racks in, then people must be using them.
Yes. So more people were going to golf on a bike than typically they were taking a train during the Great Boom. Is a broad message that comes out.
It's fascinating to see, the interesting sort of contrast between how the game evolves in Scotland and how it evolves in England. And I guess obviously it's open week here in St Andrews, and it maybe be remiss to not tie the English golf boom that you talk about, Michael, back to the Open Championship too. And it almost seems as if that the fact that more and more people in England are taking up the game from the 1860s is borne out by the fact there's increasingly a sort of English flavour to the number of Open Championship winners from sort of the 1890s on, I think.
And Open Championship venues.
Well, John Ball was the first Englishman to win the Open, and also the first amateur. In 1890. I'm sure when you talk to Stephen Proctor, he would have. His book Ball. Has. Chapter and verse on this. So to the degree there was the stories of the heroes emerging from golf were beginning to appear in the newspapers, which must have contributed to growing interest, because sport generally had been booming at that time, although golf was very much at the tail end relative to football and rugby and tennis. Golf came later.
So we get Old Tom's visits to Westward Ho, which has led to a course being made. I think Stephen touched on it in the podcast with him, that he laid out something very rudimentary and returned a few years later to lay out something a bit more substantial and in full 18. What happens after that then? What sort of time frame are we looking at, and what are who were the early adopters? Which clubs were the first to kind of adopt and go get a golf club?
Well, as I mentioned, so between 1864 and 1889, those 25 years, you got 100 golf clubs formed, a mix of inland and seaside ones. But in terms of who was designing these golf courses, if that's what the question you were referring to.
The question was who were the first? Which clubs were first? I suppose, in terms of we've got Royal North Devon first.
Well, I could sort of roughly go through the list.
Because you mentioned this.
Royal North Devon first, and then you had London Scottish, around about 1864, 65, which then there was a schism within London Scottish, which created Royal Wimbledon. There were the military side of the club stayed separate from the civilian side of the club. So
they've still got obviously the red jacket because of...
They both still exist, obviously. And then in 1869, you had 3 clubs formed. There was Royal Liverpool at Hoylake, still there to this day, Alnmouth up in the Northumberland, and Cambridge University Golf Club. Then you had a light scattering of clubs formed during the 1870s. And then... I suppose the critical one, the one that's thought most highly of in an English context today, is Royal St George's. That was formed in 1887. And that was, although it was at the coast, it was probably could be more considered to be a London club.
Yeah.
Because most of the golfers had London addresses.
Yeah.
And it was their opportunity to have...
And it's the nearest links, really, I suppose.
It was the nearest links. There were a few others earlier,
Yeah.
but that one was set up by London golfers predominantly for London golfers at that time. And that became probably to that point, Royal Liverpool was seen as the outstanding club in England, and then Royal St George's came along to not so much compete between the two clubs, but presented a bit of a beacon towards Scotland, saying we can do this also on classic links land and create courses that are of a standard where the Open Championship can be held.
Yeah.
And the Open moves there to Royal St George's in 1894.
Correct.
It's,
1894.
that's the first time being played outside Scotland.
That was right, 1894, and that was won by J.H. Taylor, I believe.
That must have been quite a big decision to send the Open south of the border, because it did mark the start of a change in thinking for golf, really, to take the Open into England.
And I think it ties into the fact that there was now a lot of golfers and a lot of golf clubs.
Yeah.
Again, maybe just to give you some statistics. There was 100 clubs by 1889. In the next quarter of a century, from 1890 to 1914, 1,200 clubs were formed in England. And they were coming in at one a week over that entire period.
Yeah.
That's the average. The peak years, 1893, 1894, just when that first Open Championship was held at Royal St George's.
Year to us, 1893. That's when our club was formed.
At Blackwell.
At Blackwell, yeah.
Yes.
1893.
So 1893, there was, you might be interested to know, there was 80 clubs formed in England in 1893, and in 1894, 80 clubs as well.
And how many of those still exist? You know, is that
well, in entirety of the 1,300 clubs formed prior to the First World War, 750 of them still exist today.
Well, that's pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, that's nearly half of all the clubs that exist in England today.
Like you said,
Yes.
they were just experimenting, really.
Yes. So they've been remarkably resilient, the clubs pre-First World War. If you look at any other industry, you don't see a structure like that at all.
No.
You know, any industry tends to have a lot of new clubs or new businesses starting up, but most of them fail very quickly. Golf clubs didn't fail. They persisted. And it was only the two wars and then austerity in the 20s and 30s and the 50s that really resulted in the loss of many of the clubs that were formed in that period. But still, it's still quite remarkable. Over 750 of these clubs exist today, and they count for nearly half of all the clubs in England.
Really?
So
Well,
they're
that
still
is
such
amazing.
a major feature.
Yeah.
I think so. And you've not wanting to. There's loads of things that I want to touch on here, Michael. But with writing your book, we talked about this just before we started recording the podcast. You've got another route of self-publication with this. How is that as a stressful endeavour, having to publish it yourself? Was that quite a stressful thing, or did you find it quite straightforward?
Well, self-publishing is a lot easier now than perhaps it used to be in the past. So the process is quite straightforward. So when I start writing, I'm just creating a Word document and compiling images and charts and graphs that I might feed into that. And in the end, over the period of writing it, which in this case was nearly 4 years, I ended up with a Word document and a set of images that I wanted to incorporate into the book.
Yeah.
And then fortunately, I've used the same firm of publishing and services, as a published servicing company.
Yeah.
So they provide this services of editing, layout, design, proofreading, all these things that take you from a Word document eventually to a PDF.
Yeah.
And then the PDF then gets sent to a printer, and 1 month later you've
got your book.
books arrive.
4 years is a long time, Michael. Was there ever a point where you thought, yeah, I'm a bit done now, I could stop?
There were times when I was asking the question, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
This is nuts.
It's a big undertaking covering such a huge period, I guess.
Yeah.
All the data you've had to collect.
Well, the data collection was the hard part because,
Yeah.
and I went right back to source. So I'm not sure you know, but in the late 19th century, there was a genre of golf books that came out called the golf yearbooks, golf annuals, and each year a book, about 2 inches thick would be published. And it'd be at the front. It would have the stories of the day: who won the Open, who won the Ladies Amateur, etc. But at the back was a directory of all the golf clubs that existed at that point in time.
Right.
So what I did was then went through that directory, and for each of the clubs, I put it into a database. And for each club, I had information on when it was formed, where it was located, how many members it had, how much it cost to be a member, what was the nearest railway station, whether you could play golf there on a Sunday, and information about the golf course itself, how many holes it had, what sort of type of land it was on, and all I had to do was do that for each year. And make sure all of that was consistent.
You say all you had to do. You've just
I'm being ironic.
1,500 clubs.
So that index changing, year on year.
Because each year there was new clubs.
You're looking for the few
new star
few
in
more
the
clubs
sky,
that are added.
So each year there was new clubs that were added, and of course, if you take a particular year, 1893, some clubs didn't file their information to the publication until 1895.
Yeah.
So you were always trying to track I wanted to make sure I didn't miss any.
Yeah.
And I feel fairly confident I've got the lot.
Yeah, you don't want someone calling you up and saying, "You've missed us out."
I'm sure there are errors in there, but I've done as much as I think is humanely possible to put together a database.
Killing yourself, I'm
and
sure.
And some clubs changed their name, they changed their location, some merged, some split apart, and you had to capture all of that detail to ensure that you're telling the story correctly.
And there was a lot of magazines that offer up a lot of information about golf, weren't they? They would write about the golf results and things like that.
Yes,
they're helpful.
The two that I used, which were related, one was it started in 1890 called Golf, and that became Golf Illustrated in 1899, and it was a weekly golf.
You forget how old that is, don't you?
Yeah,
Golf Illustrated.
Golf Illustrated 1899. The pre-runner to that was Golf because it didn't have many illustrations in it. That was the only difference. So, and these are wonderful publications, and so they would have the stories of the day, what's happening, and also which clubs have just been formed. It'd have the results of golf, and this is where you could see that they were clearly all beginners because the scores were always in the hundreds. And also it had...
That's like my golf, actually. I'm not a beginner, but...
They were using hickories though, Mills, so come on. Don't flatter yourself too much.
Well, they also had, stories about the great champions. They also had jokes.
Oh, did they?
So there's a joke on the very first... Can I
yeah, certainly, yeah.
read it out? You'll love this. This is in the very first page of the first chapter. This appeared in Golf on the 10th of July, 1891. An English young lady lately returned from a visit to Scotland. She was remarking to her friends at home on the wonderful extension of the game of golf. "It is played everywhere now," she said. "It has even spread to Scotland." So you got jokes like that were published each week.
Oh,
but also some serious debates about the rules of golf took place in the letters pages, correspondence between different golfers on how things should be dealt with.
The age-old distance debate, which we like to think is a recent phenomenon.
Not at all. The invention of the Haskell golf ball in the late 1890s and first introduced here in 1902. That was maybe even a bigger debate then than the debate we've been going through in recent times.
Varden really fought off playing the Haskell, didn't he? He had the Varden Flyer for ages. Obviously, just pulled that out just before the Haskell came out.
Well, the three great professionals there, Braid, Varden, and Taylor, they all had advertising contracts to sell gutta percha golf balls, which sold for about $1 a ball. Yeah. But these balls, new balls that came in, they went much further. A bit more difficult to control. But the top golfers, of course, got to the top because they were very good at playing with the gutta
Yeah.
percha ball. So that, to some extent, they were a bit threatened by this
Yeah.
new ball coming in. Anyway, they continued to play with it until Sandy Hurd,
Yeah.
borrowed a ball from John Ball Jr. in 1902, one ball, and he managed to play 4 rounds of the Open with it and won the Open
Yeah.
by a shot in 1902. And that was the beginning of the end. Varden played with it the next year and beat Taylor by 16 shots, who was still using the old ball.
That's so
that
Couldn't relinquish his loyalty to his.
these were the top golfers of the day,
Yeah.
and that was the passing of the Gutty. And even though the Haskell ball was 2 shillings and 6pence, it was more expensive. It did seem to be more reliable and more resilient than even the gutter ball, and so that was the end of that. So,
But
the
you are
handle.
on we have taken up a lot of your time just before your book signing, so we're really lucky that we've been able to squeeze in a little bit of time to talk to you about it. How can one get their hands on this wonderful book?
Well, as a self-publishing author, you have to contact me.
Okay, straight to have you got a website?
So, no, I just have an email address.
Oh, perfect, which is?
So my email address is mike.morrison57@outlook.com. The book is in hardback and colour. It's 320 pages with over 200 illustrations, and it's priced at £25 plus postage and packing.
Or you could get to the Golf Museum and see you sign a few now. That would be, if you could go back in time, because this won't be released. But
I brought a couple of boxes of books to the museum this morning, so that was all I could carry.
No, it's fabulous, Michael. Honestly, it's been really lovely to talk to you, and good to finally meet up in person. So, thank you for coming on the podcast and explaining about your lovely book.
Good to meet you both too.
Thanks for coming
Thanks,
on.
Michael.
Cheers.
Watch this.